Hi everyone, welcome to Widowed and Young. I'm Shalini Bhalla-Lucas and I am an ambassador for Way. And this is Widowed and Young's Instagram live series, 25 Tuesdays. Over 25 weeks, we will be talking to 25 people about their stories of widowhood. And over the next 6 weeks, I will be talking about widowhood taboos. So we'll be challenging widowhood stereotypes, looking at sexual bereavement, widow's fire, moving forward with new love, do men grieve differently from women, cultural challenges in interracial marriages, the messiness of grief, and what's right and what's wrong, if there is such a thing, in grieving. And that's over the next 6 weeks. But today I am so excited to be talking to a wonderful writer, a woman who lost her husband a very short time ago in 2018, and this is Kat Lister. And I really like Kat to join us as soon as it's possible. I know she's here, so she's going to request shortly. And just to say, she's written this incredibly powerful book, The Elements, and you can see it's written there by Kat Lister. And I've actually just got my copy here today. I have read it though. I read it on Kindle. And Kat's here. Let's just invite her. She's going to talk about the book, but also we'll be asking her loads of questions around, there we go.
Hi.
Around widowhood. Hi, Kat. Welcome
Hello.
to Widowed and Young.
Thank you for having me. I've changed locations, so you get a glamorous view into my kitchen.
Okay, you look lovely, actually. You've worn red specifically because we talk about the color red today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. So, Kat, thank you for giving us your time. And just to say, I've read The Elements and it's a hugely powerful book, and we're going to talk about it shortly. And I know you're going to read from the book as well. I just want people to give us a thumbs up to say they can see and hear us okay. I can see you fine. Can you hear and see me okay, Kat?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So Kat, you were married to, and it's interesting because in your book you never actually say his name. You always call him my husband, but we know that you were married to Pat, who was a journalist himself, and he died in 2018. How did you meet Pat?
We met at a musical weekly called The Enemy, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. And I was working on the news desk, and he was one of the editors there. I was very fresh-faced to the music business. So we worked together actually for about 1.5 to 2 years before we actually started dating. So I always say that there's no sort of grand romantic anecdote for how we got together. We worked together for a while, and then a few years after the first day that I started at NME, I bumped into him at a colleague's leaving do in Camden, I think I remember it. And just one of those strange things where it's almost like you're having the first conversation with somebody who you've known for a while, and something just clicked into place, and we started dating from that day on. And we were together for a decade. So a large chunk of my, I guess, growing up, we started dating when I was 25 and he passed away when I was 35. So if you consider that decade as really, the time when you're formulating who you are and how you see the world, what you're looking for, it was such a wrench when he died. There felt like there was this void there, which was incredibly difficult for me at such a young age.
He was in his 30s when he met you and died when he was 41. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, he was 40.
So actually, they were formative years for you as well as him, because I think that the years 20 to 40 are so formative as adulthood.
Yeah.
And so you kind of grew up together in a way.
Yeah, we did. Although he was always incredibly wise. So I always feel like probably even when he was a little boy, he was probably a mature man. He had this calmness about him, and actually it was I felt an incredible responsibility to try and depict Pat a little bit in the book, which is so hard when you're writing about somebody and the reader is never going to get to meet this person, and he was such a special, incredible soul, extraordinary person, extraordinary mind. He was actually writing his own book in the hospice when he died. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to finish it. that then takes on a whole new emphasis when you write a book, because I felt like I was writing this on behalf of two people, not just me.
Because you wanted to tell his story in a way as well. But the book is very much from your perspective. We'll come back to that. What happened? So what happened to Pat it was a few days after his 35th birthday, is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, we had a few clues that something might have been up. Occasionally he would drop his keys, struggle to find a word, but these little things you don't really think add up to a brain tumour, which is what we discovered that he had. We were living separately at the time, and he was living alone in Stoke Newington, and I was in southwest London. And he called me late one afternoon, I think it was a Sunday, to say that he had woken up, or he thought he had woken up, with bruises down one side of his face and his body. And he didn't know how they'd got there. He had had a seizure and didn't know that he'd had a seizure. And he went to A&E, and that's when he was scanned, CT scan at first, then more complex MRIs revealed that probably for the length of our entire relationship, a mixed glioma brain tumour had been growing in his brain, and it was now the size of a lemon. And for anyone who doesn't know what a mixed glioma brain tumour is, and why would you unless you've personally experienced it, it's a cluster, it's a mixture of different kinds of tumours. It's liable to change and to morph. And because only 70% of his tumour could be resected, could be operated on, we always knew that the remaining 30% was liable to morph into a far more aggressive brain tumour, which is a glioblastoma brain tumour, which is eventually what happened. But this occurred over a very protracted period of time, so 6 years, at the point where it morphed, and part of it then turned into a glioblastoma. He was given a few weeks to live, and actually he lived for 6 weeks.
Okay, so how, and for all the people watching, please, some of you, this may be a trigger for you, so please do hold yourself in compassion. And Kat, you too, just please tell us as much or as little as you want, and if you need to stop at any time, please do. I want to ask you what those 6 years were like, because I know you had some happy times, you had some really tough times, you became a carer. How do you remember those 6 years?
To be honest, it's very mixed, as grief is. It's a very multifaceted thing. And I would say on any given day, I will recall different elements to those 6 years. And some days the memories are hard and barbed, and other days they're softer. And I feel grateful that they are, and that I think memories, when we're thinking about trauma as well, it ebbs and flows, and it's never one state. And I think this is where the elements come in, is like everything is always subject to change, to transformation. Some days I can recall very traumatic memories, and other days I remember a joke that we shared together, a holiday that we went on. Those 6 years were complicated. It was a complex illness that even the best brains, the best scientists, the best doctors couldn't figure out. And we always knew that whatever treatment he would have, it was always buying some more time. It was never going to be a fix. And so that anxiety, and actually Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with the 5 stages of grief, as I know we're all familiar with, also came up with a term called anticipatory grief. And I think that is actually a very accurate term to describe the feeling of the mini griefs that you experience when you're living with such a complex illness. And I would say that was the trickiest to maneuver around, I would say, because I always knew that 30% of the tumour wasn't going to be able to simply disappear, it was always going to be there. And we had to deal with the reality of that, whilst also trying to enjoy our time, together. We didn't really want to be pitied, we wanted to be like everyone else. We didn't want to be othered by what was happening to us. And I think it's so incredibly hard not to feel that way when you're going through something so intense, so huge, that a lot of our contemporaries just didn't have any personal experience with. I think that was quite tough.
Because you were both so young, and this kind of
Incredibly
thing, you
young.
just don't
Yes.
expect it to happen.
Yes.
Did you get married in that time?
Yes, so we got married a year after his diagnosis. And I remember that day as being so happy. I was so grateful to have this wedding day, because you know, when he was diagnosed, I didn't know how long we were going to have together. You know, eventually we spent the next 6 years together, but at that point we didn't know what the future was going to hold for us. So even the wedding day itself was joyful, but also I would say it was tinged with the sadness of the not knowing, which is incredibly difficult to deal with.
Yeah,
The
it's almost like,
unknowability of, you know, what was going to happen.
yeah, absolutely. It's like wanting to live life, but living in limbo as well. In a way, it's very strange.
Exactly.
You talk about the elements, so let's talk about your book, which, as I've
Yes.
said quite a few times, is hugely powerful. And it's entitled The Elements of Widowhood.
Yes.
And in it, you talk about the difficulties of dealing. Now, let's talk about why you never actually call him Pat. You always say, my husband. We know it's Pat because at the beginning, it's dedicated to him.
Yes.
What was that, a conscious decision not to name him through the book?
Not at the beginning. So before this book came out, I wrote numerous essays. And one essay in particular, the first I would say that I wrote was for the Sunday Times magazine. And in that, I would say, no, it wasn't a conscious decision. I think maybe subliminally I was trying to give myself the freedom to write in the way that I knew that I needed to. And I think that that was actually quite a primal instinct. I don't think that that was something that I sat down and methodically thought about. I would say that when I sat down to write this book, it was a decision that I made for numerous reasons, out of respect for Pat, for his privacy. He was an incredibly private man. And I always knew that this book, though it is obviously going to include Pat, was about my experience of grief and widowhood after his death. And therefore, I wanted him to be a presence in the book, but I didn't want to pull him into something that he hadn't really given permission for, and that was incredibly important for me. So there was that, but I also think there are lots of things in the book that perhaps I wouldn't have been able to write if I was to name him on every other page. I think that would bring him into the room in a way that would maybe make me feel a little bit anxious about what I was writing about. And as we're about to explore in this next hour, there's a lot in this book, multiple griefs, but also, you know, it's called a widowhood, but I'd also say it's a womanhood. You know, it's about reclamation of one's physicality after years and years of trauma. And I think because of that was the major reason why I decided not to name him.
Okay, that's so interesting, that, and it's very much from your perspective. And it's interesting because over 6 years, you talk about multiple griefs, and we'll go into that because there was also miscarriages and IVF. There's so much to really talk about. But did Pat change as a person over those 6 years because of the tumor? Was there anything that was, you can say, yes, there were changes, not just physically, but I mean maybe as a person, personality-wise?
I have to say I was incredibly relieved, because my biggest fear when the disease progressed was that he would lose sense of himself. And that was his biggest fear as well. And I would have to say that didn't happen, and I was very grateful that it didn't. Pat was an incredibly wise, calm, gentle, the gentlest man I've ever met, gracious. You know, if he was in a room with people, he'd want to hear about what you have to say about something. What do you do? He always wanted to listen to the other person, and he had an extraordinary knowledge of so many different topics: music, film, books. He was one of the most brainiest person I've ever met in my life. And yet, you know, if you were at a house party with him, he'd want to know what you had to say about something, and that was the strength of the man. He never lost that. what was upsetting was that because of the epilepsy, so he struggled with epilepsy as a byproduct of the brain tumor that he had. Now, he once said to me that after every seizure that he had, he felt like a tiny bit of him had been taken away. There was a slight distancing that happened. And I think that that probably had an impact on him. But I would say the core of him, who he was, no, that never changed. I just think brain tumours being what they are, of course, there was a bit of distancing that occurred. That sometimes it felt like he wasn't 100% in the room. He suffered a lot of absence seizures. I think we understand epilepsy to be the grand mal seizure, very physical, violent episodes, which did occur. But once he was put on the medication that he was on, these absence seizures, you wouldn't necessarily know that he was having one. It's just he kind of would drift off and then he'd come back again. I would say they were probably harder to deal with than the grand mal seizures, which might sound strange, but I guess because it's not a recognisable physical disability that I felt that others could recognise to keep him safe.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting because I've not heard of that from when you talk about epilepsy, that kind of feeling of distance, that he was very distant. You talk about Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, and we think that it's kind of linear, but it's not. And I really, in your book, you talk about grief is neither a romantic, opium-fueled Coleridge poem nor a beautiful and stylized. It's messy and rough. It's unforgiving and cruel. Can we talk about that? Because I feel that for those of us who've lost a spouse, it's very difficult to explain how messy grief is.
Now, I know that everybody watching this video will know that any person going through grief carries innumerable different kinds of things that you feel guilty about, you know, things that you did wrong. You'll look back and think, I didn't handle that in the right way. It was really important with this book to do away with this myth that there is a right way to grieve and a wrong way to grieve. In the same way that I don't believe that there is a right way to care for somebody or a wrong way to care for somebody, you know, if your heart is there and you're trying your best, okay? It was really important for me, as difficult as it sometimes was in this book, to be as honest as possible, that I laid bare the messiness, the roughness of grief. And there are aspects to grief that we don't like to engage with. And I confronted those head on. And I did that precisely because I think culturally and socially, we have come to recognise these 5 stages. And it's very important also to point out that these 5 stages were not designed for those who are grieving, they were designed for those who were dying. Now, that's a very important distinction. And that was adapted over time. The idea that a person will neatly transition through these stages is incorrect. And I think it places a person under even more pressure than they're already under to deal with something perfectly. And actually not deal with something, deal with the worst thing that's ever happened to you in a perfect way. It's just not possible. And there's actually a great writer, scientist, psychologist, George Bonanno, and he came up with the term coping ugly. It's the term coping ugly. And in one of my first essays I wrote about it, I discovered him in the Wellcome Library, which is where I went very early on in my grief to try and read as much as I could to understand this frightening thing that was happening to me. I felt so untethered from myself that I found myself pulled into the library and I read one of his books, and coping ugly for me summed up where I was at, which was I could go through the 5 stages in about a minute. Okay. I felt like I had lost my mind. I felt like I was mad. And it's not madness. It's just your brain's trying to catch up with what has just happened. And it is impossible to be able to neatly tiptoe through that. It's a ridiculous notion, really.
For those of you who the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and you go through all those and more, much more.
Oh,
and
yeah.
quagmire of emotion. Let's talk about the everyday stuff that became triggers for you, or memories, or because you talk in the book about how your husband was reduced to a pile of ordinary things after he died. So the shower gel, the toothbrush.
Yeah, yeah.
What
And
do you
actually,
mean?
in the book, I describe it as coming back from the hospice with plastic bags, of his things.
Yeah.
I write about how his hospice room was his world. It became his world. It became this very intimate space, and the only control he had was where his things were. It became so important in the last final days of his life to know where everything was. He wanted to always know every day where his wedding ring had been put on. He wanted to know if it was on the counter, and it would be brought to him in the morning and he'd put it back on his finger. It was the same with his notebooks. He was writing a book. He had piles of notebooks. So the day that I brought all of this mishmash of things home in plastic bags, I put them on the floor of this kitchen, and they looked like shopping bags ready to unpack. And yet they were the last vestiges of the husband who I loved. It is such a strange reality to find yourself in, that you do feel like you're Alice in Wonderland. It's like all the rules have just gone out of the window. They've disappeared, and you're having to navigate such madness. At the same time, you're having to be very practical. You're having to do like the Deathmin stuff. You're having to sit down and figure out, the practicalities of how you're going to sort through all this paperwork, the footprints of the person who's gone, passwords, digital footprint.
Yeah.
It's there's so much to do at a time when you just want to shut yourself off in a darkened room, don't you? And pull down the blinds and go to sleep.
How long between Pat dying and his funeral? How many weeks did you have?
Do you know what? I don't remember. And this is interesting, and this is important, because recently I've had a few conversations with friends where they have mentioned something and I have no memory of it. And this is very soon after Pat died. So I had a friend here for dinner recently, and I said to her, "When's the last time you were here?" I think it was probably when Pat was still alive. And she said, "No, we were sorting through some of Pat's records in the living room about 2 weeks after he died." I have no recollection of it, and I'm a journalist, so I know that I know that I have a good memory, but that's gone. That even now can make me feel it's quite destabilizing. And I write a lot in the book about not being able to trust things. Now that's tricky to navigate. Not being able to trust time. I've said in numerous interviews now, the elasticity of time, and I didn't trust it. It didn't make sense to me. It had warped so much that I didn't know what time meant for me in my life. So that was really tricky. I would say the same with memory. And that, I think, probably threads through into time itself, the things that you hold on to, the things that you forget, memories that will pop up now, memories that I'm desperately trying to find, and they're somewhere at the back of my mind, but I can't quite get a handle on them. I can't get a grip on them. It's so hard when the person that you shared a life with is no longer there to remind you of things.
Yeah. But also, if you think about it, this is such a traumatic time in your life that it's almost like you're going through some kind of PTSD, where your brain does actually protect you from certain memories. Yes. And I know that there are certain things in the first year of my husband's bereavement that when I was grieving, I can't remember. And actually, maybe my brain doesn't want me to remember because it'll just be too much. I just don't know. Yeah. Kat, there's you talk about this. I found this very interesting, where you talk about in the book, avoiding the fruit aisles at the supermarket because it reminded you of his brain tumor.
Mm.
And that's really talking about triggers, how triggers come in the most weird places, the most weird times as well. Have you felt that over the years, that you've been triggered at times that you least expected?
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight that I still struggle with that now. And you're talking about PTSD and trauma, and that's something that I have. It's not something that has been completely sorted. It's something that I'm still trying to make my way through. And it's very hard. It was interesting when you introduced me, because you said that it hadn't been long since Pat had died. And we're talking about, how time can be so temperamental, because sometimes I feel like this pressure that I should be all better now, because it's nearly been 4 years. I still, although I've written this book, and I am, I underline time and time again that, what we've just said, that there's no linear timeline to this, that everyone is different, and that with such an acute loss like this, it's going to take many, many more years. I will be struggling with my memories of what happened for the rest of my life. But it's hard, and I think it's important to remind yourself that, like you've just said, it hasn't been a long time. Not really, not in the grand scheme of one's entire lifetime.
But I think also there's this feeling as widows and widowers that there is a timeline that you should be okay now. But when is that? Should you be okay after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And isn't it different for everybody else? And actually, are you ever fully okay? And I think that's something we don't talk about enough, that nobody can tell us. I feel that's kind of a taboo. Nobody can tell us when you stop grieving, if ever. So I think this thing where that linear, okay, there's a time scale, you should be okay now.
And I don't think grief. I don't think grief ever stops. I don't think it dissipates. I think that you learn to recognize yourself and your grief as time goes on. You become more experienced in recognizing the triggers, in recognizing your responses, and it's almost like you sort of you kind of wrap yourself around it, don't you? You learn to sort of like grow around this pain at the center. It's always going to be painful, because the person I loved the most was wrenched away from me. And also, that's the other thing, the limitations of language. It's not I write in the book, it's not a loss, because it's not like I'd lost my wallet on the way to work, My husband was very painfully wrenched away from me. He was 41, way before his time. That's not okay, and that's never going to be okay. Some days I feel it more than others. And I often say that Pat for me is like the air, like bringing the elements. He's like the air around me, and some days I feel him like a breeze, and sometimes it's, it's very soft, and other days it's like a gale. And I never know when those days are coming. And, I still get them. I'll probably always get them. It's not something that you're ever going to feel like, 100% now understand this grief thing, get it, and I'm done. And I think the language that we use can confuse people, because we talk about moving on, don't we?
Yeah.
Moving on. It gives us these weird visuals, I think, like loss, like you just dropped something, or someone's passed on, like to where, my main questions when, Pat died was like, where is he? Like tangibly, where is he? Where can I find him? So things like he's passed somewhere else is like past is such a neutral word, isn't it?
It's awful.
It doesn't really mean anything.
It's an awful word. Yeah.
And so I became very angry with language.
We're very scared of saying he died, his death. We're very scared of using, or we were. I mean, I was. Now I'm not. I'm much more, he's died. He's not just passed. And I think, because I think also, I feel that, as you say, language like passed on doesn't show the gravity of what's happened, whereas he's died. is much more stark, and that's actually what's happened.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think language is interesting. Talking of language, I want to go into stereotypes of the taboos, the red stilettos, etc. But I think it'd be great for you to read the excerpt here that you've chosen, because I know that really ties in well with some taboos we're going to talk about. So you happy to read a little bit?
I'm going to read from this. So just as a little preface to this reading, so obviously it's called the elements. It's divided between the 4 elements. So it begins with fire, it begins with my husband's ashes, and then it goes through from fire to water to earth and air. And those are almost like the 4 seasons, I would say, of my first year of widowhood. Okay. So I'm going to be reading from the water section, which is the second section. And in water, what happens is Pat and I got engaged in Mexico. It's a very special place for us and for me still. And I call it a pilgrimage. I go back very soon after Pat died with my best friend, because I want to retrace my steps. It was a very important thing for me to do. I guess in what we were saying about where is he, it was like trying to find like a map pin to find where he was. Actually, I was trying to find myself. So this section is taken from there, and I make reference to La Catrina in this first sentence. And La Catrina in Mexico is, I would say, like the Grand Duchess of the afterlife. She's exuberant, she's very colourful, she flirts with death. She's very brassy, and she taps into why I was so pulled into Mexico, especially after Pat died, was the way that they engage with death felt so different to me compared to how we do it here, which is very stiff and formal and Victorian. And in Mexico, it's, you know, they confront it head on, and it's very much a part of life, you know, that the dead are not separate from the living, that there's no wall there. And so that's going to explain some of these references.
Okay.
La Catrina and I share a name, but I also think we share a sensibility. On the morning of my husband's funeral, I put on some crimson lipstick and zipped my feet into a pair of ruby red boots. Defiant sartorial choices that subconsciously sparred with my new status. Yes, they said, I had chosen to be a 30-year-old bride, but I hadn't asked to be this 35-year-old widow. Weeks later, I hosted a wake at his favourite pub in central London. Whilst friends and family engaged in quiet and thoughtful conversations, I spun drunkenly on the dance floor as my best friend Andy played Stax classics and freakbeat hits. The morning conventions rankled me, and I wasn't playing ball. Not that anyone said anything that afternoon which particularly riled me. In fact, everyone seemed to understand my changeable moods and offbeat choices. There seemed to be a general consensus that whatever I did was whatever I needed to do. I am forever grateful to the 100-odd mourners at the Betsy Trotwood pub who left me to hustle on the dance floor without pulling me out of my disturbed revelry or making me feel self-conscious about it. That said, there was an element of defiance at play that day, a resistive attitude that seemed to go against what I believed to be certain stereotypes of how a grieving woman should behave, even how she should dress. Picture Queen Victoria in her sombre black robes, a timeless image that centuries later we still refer to when talking about death, grief, and widowhood. When her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, it sent her into a deep depression that she never fully recovered from, initiating a cult of grief that Richard Brilliant, author of Death from Dust to Destiny, calls active mourning. She grieved for him by wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her life, avoiding public appearances and comfort eating to the point of excessive weight gain, a state of perpetual mourning and self-flagellation that earned her the nickname the Widow of Windsor. In one photograph, dated towards the end of her life, her puffy face looks down dejectedly at the floor, nervous hands interlaced at her lap, drowning under layer upon layer of black silk taffeta and crepe. When I look at her wearied body, I am reminded of the historical rituals of widowhood that I read about at the Wellcome Library in the winter of my grief. An 18th century painting illustrating the ancient practice of sati in South Asia, the good wife who submits herself to the flames of her husband's funeral pyre in order to die alongside him, a horrifying funeral practice that has since been banned in India. During the Victorian era, mourning became a performance as well as a manifestation of loss, especially for a widow who was simultaneously expected to carry out the duties of her gender. The first stage, full mourning, where a woman wore sombre dress and was socially excluded for a year and a day. The second stage, a period that generally lasted for 9 months, where a woman was banned from attending gatherings such as Sunday Mass, concerts and weddings. And the third stage, a so-called half mourning, where colour was gradually reintroduced back into her wardrobe. The etiquette for widowers, on the flip side of the coin, lasted between 3 to 6 months. I wouldn't say that my rebelliousness was always a conscious action, but I do think that I was aware of all the customs and conventions that I felt at odds with. If you were to have asked me on that weekday morning, when I headed into town and handpicked a pair of red stiletto boots to wear to my husband's funeral, why I had picked them out, I'm sure I would have shrugged and simply said, why not? Looking back, I now realise that there was more to this sartorial choice than met the eye. I was, in fact, sending a clear signal out into the world, a reminder that I was independent from what was happening to me. Granted, my options were limited in those early days, but the ones I had, I seized. Funeral styling aside, it wasn't until I returned from my Mexican pilgrimage that I really began to tussle with my new title. I read about a widow called Loretta de Braus, who upon the death of her husband in the early 13th century, withdrew from everything she knew to live as an anchoress in a church cell in Canterbury, a living death that she forfeited herself to until her actual death 45 years later. I also mused on the sexist stereotypes that I had passively absorbed on my television screen growing up in the 1990s. The voiceless and beautiful Scottish widow, dewy-eyed and cloaked in black, calmly leading us out of the maze. There is a mysticism to widowhood. She quietly courts our gaze. Cast your mind back to Jackie Kennedy veiled in black on the steps of the United States Capitol in 1963. A silent image that we have appropriated to exalt an impossible ideal, the dignity of the grieving widow. Its etymology grated on me too. In Hebrew, the word for widow is almna, from the root alem, meaning unable to speak. Its Indo-European origin is to be empty. And yet, when I looked at my engagement ring and wedding band, a duo of remembrances I reassigned from left hand to right upon my return from Mexico City, I felt neither hollow nor mute, but anxious to move and bursting with life. To anyone who asked, I was very honest about my frustrations. I didn't want to smooth over what was happening, and I didn't see why I should subscribe to a role that I hadn't signed up for. I was angry. I felt abandoned too. To add insult to injury, I couldn't even lob these painful feelings at the person who had left me behind. Believe me, I tried. I quarrelled with my husband at inopportune times, usually when something hadn't quite gone my way, when my coat got jammed in the door, for instance, or when I spilled my morning coffee. Who knows? Maybe Jackie Kennedy did too.
Thank you, Kat. There's so much in those 4 or 5 pages. So for those of you listening, you can imagine the rest of the book has so much. There was so much there. There was the crimson lipstick, the stiletto boots, the dancing drunkenly. There was so much that you did that most people would be like, is she really grieving? What's going on?
Yes.
Or, exactly. But then also the women versus men. I say versus, but women and men, how differently we're viewed. And to grieve, we're expected to grieve longer than men, and the clothes and just the term widow. I mean, there's so much there, right?
Yes, and I really, really did struggle with calling myself a widow. And I still pick and choose when I do it even now. It's really hard, when we talk about language and how powerful it is. you know, the titles that we give ourselves, the clothes that we wear. You know, these may sound like superficial things, but they're not. You know, I remember writing my first essay for the Sunday Times magazine, and I knew when I wanted to write that piece, because I was in a changing room, I was trying on jeans, and I felt completely lost. I'd completely lost sense of who I was. I had no idea what I was doing. I was putting, like, I'd say almost like trying to put on different skins to see which one looked the most like me. At a time when I looked in the mirror, I didn't even know what I was looking at. It was a completely different woman looking back at me. I felt so fragmented that it was in these changing rooms that I started to, I guess, attempt to put myself back together. And I was so surprised when the piece came out, because I was expecting everyone to say, you know, what a ridiculous angle. But I had so many people get in touch with me saying that they understood, that they had felt the same way. And that's when I knew that, you know, Pat always used to say to me, this is one of the best things he's ever said to me, you know, you're not as weird as you think you are, which kind of annoyed me at the time, but now I take it as a comfort. And what he was saying was, you know, the weirdest, darkest thought that you have in your head, believe me, there is, even if there's like one other person on the other side of the world having that thought, they exist, they're there. And what's been incredible about writing this book is having conversations with those reading it who have been through a similar kind of experience, who have said, me too. And that me too not only helps them, it absolutely helps me, because it validates every anxiety I had putting this book out, thinking, what are people going to think of me?
But what were you thinking when you wore the red stiletto boots or were dancing at the wake? Did you care what people thought, or were you trying? What were you trying to reclaim there?
I think I was trying to push back. I think that I was trying to hold on to myself, who I was, my individuality, because I felt it had been sucked out of me by years and years of illness and then the death itself. And it was my way of saying, I'm still here. I'm still here and I want to live. And that was in, I wouldn't even say it was even a thought in my head. It was just this deep, 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 I would say, desire in my gut to live.
But that was very soon after he died. Because
Yeah.
for many people, that it doesn't happen for a few months after. Was it this conscious decision that, no, I am going to live? Was that straight away?
I would say there was a lot of shock, because there had been a lot of trauma. So it wasn't, Pat didn't die instantly. We had 6 years of an illness that affected every single facet of our lives together. I learned how to contain myself. I learned how to mute myself just to get through the days. I learned how not to plan for the future. I learned how to always be in the present. And this is the issue when you are living with an illness. These are the deep problems that occur when you're living with an illness. And like I write in the book, it felt like a third person in the house. It felt like an intruder had come into our house, taken up residence. And you have to try and get on with your life, and you have to get on with the everyday. But that builds up over time. So I would say when Pat died and I was left alone, I don't think there was a lot of thought that went into it. I would say probably the red boots and the dancing, it was just a sort of like, you know how I say like Pat always retained himself up until the end? Well, I'd say it's probably the same for me, that was just me, that was my soul, it was still there. And it wasn't a methodical decision that I made to buy a pair of red boots. Genuinely, I went into M&S and I had to buy some shoes, and I picked those. I couldn't tell you why. And when I'm writing the book and I look back, I can now analyze that, and I can definitely say, of course, there were other things going on there. But at the time, I'd been in a car. I literally felt like I'd been in a car crash. So I was so in shock that I think there was just like this default me that occurred at that
That
time.
comes. So what would you say to a young widow now, right? Going through what we've been through very early on. We have all these societal and cultural and family kind of what this is how you should be as a widow, this is how you should go. What would you say to somebody having done the red stilettos and drunkenly dancing? What would you say to a young widow today going through probably the first few weeks of bereavement?
Honestly, do what feels naturally for you. I have always been very clear with this book that this isn't a manual. If I'd have come up with a proposal for a manual, it probably would have got published a lot quicker than it did. There are no answers here. All this is my account of my first year of widowhood. I don't profess to be an agony aunt. I don't profess to have all the answers, and I still don't, and I'm very honest about that. Grief is ongoing for me. What this is a very honest account. And I hope that those reading it might feel less lonely in their grief than I did in mine.
Okay, so that's and so do it how you want to do it, basically.
Yeah.
You talk in your book, your counselor suggested you were mourning two deaths. The passing of your husband was the obvious one, but the death of yourself, or at least part of yourself. But there was also the whole because you had IVF, so you tried to have a baby, you had a miscarriage. So there's so much in there as well. There's so much complexity around that. I feel like you were mourning a lot in a very short space of time. Do you feel that's true? Is that a true depiction?
And I didn't even have the space to grieve the miscarriage and the failed IVF. There was no space for that, so I didn't. So again, when Pat died, it all came in a tsunami. These past traumas that I had been through. You know, I write in the book, and this was very difficult for me to write and probably very stark for some to read, but I felt important to include that before Pat was transferred to St Christopher's Hospice, he was at King's College Hospital. And I had a surgically managed miscarriage because mine wasn't occurring naturally. So I had to have a little op. And every morning that I went to visit Pat, who I knew was dying, I walked past the surgery unit where I had my miscarriage. Again, I did it silently. I didn't share that with anybody. I just had to go on with my day of caring for Pat and making sure that everything had been planned and thought about, and that his friends, you know, myself and his sister, we came up with a timetable for friends to. So again, we don't talk about these things, the practicalities when someone is dying. Going into an Excel spreadsheet and making a timetable for slots for friends to say goodbye. These are the realities when someone is dying. These are the things that happen. So I would say there was no space for me to mourn the miscarriage. And that was pretty brutal because the miscarriage was happening when I knew that Pat was desperately ill.
It's so difficult because you become a carer first and a wife, and everything else kind of takes a back seat. So your own feelings and they take a back seat because, as I say, you become a carer first.
Yes.
And your spouse becomes the most. His needs became very important and probably paramount. But you did freeze his sperm.
Yes.
And you've written about that in an article, because very recently you've had to kind of come to terms with that. Are you going to use the sperm? Are you going to have his children? What have you decided? Are you able to share that? Because that in itself is so complex.
It is. I would say it's still quite, it's ambiguous, and I would say probably what's in the Observer magazine piece is what I'm comfortable sharing. Sure. The reason that I did write that piece was to explore the ethics of that, I guess, and the sort of thoughts that you have in such an unusual circumstance. And really what this piece is about, although mine is quite a unique predicament to find yourself in when you're talking about posthumous sperm, it's about what you hold on to and what you let go of. And that can include memories, or it can include, you know, the things that are left behind. You know, I guess his sperm is one of them, but you know, there's, you know, as we all know, you know, objects and things, they take on very meaningful significance after a person has died. And I've written quite extensively about this, about the meaningfulness of things. And sometimes the most ordinary and quotidian of things become like spiritual like in your life, because they come to represent something that has been
Can you
lost.
give me an example?
Well, I've it's weird to me, the things that I have held on to and the things that I've let go. So I still have his wallet, which still has his debit card in, and it's still in the little dish that he always put it in. I even now I can't explain why. It doesn't. I think it goes beyond reason, even for someone like me who always, like, you know, it's always my thing to try and figure things out. And I've come to the conclusion that there's no rhyme or reason to it.
No, and I think when we try and put an explanation to everything, we kind of do ourselves a disservice. You've kept the wallet because you want to keep the wallet, and that is your reason.
Yes.
And I think that's reason enough. I'm really conscious of time. We can talk forever. We've only got a few more minutes.
Oh gosh, it's gone by really quickly.
I know it has, because I told everybody to tune in because this has been so fascinating. But I do want to talk, and for those of you who either missed the talk, it will be on our archives, but please go out and get this book. It is available Kindle, and I'm in Kenya, and I've got it in Kenya, so there's no excuse.
I can't tell you how happy I am that it's with you in Kenya. Honestly, look how far it's travelled. Amazing.
I know. There you go.
Can you take it out somewhere and just photograph it like out and about?
I will. I'll tell you what. I'll make sure there's an elephant or a lion in the background, and I'm going
yes,
to send
please
you
do.
I will definitely do that for you. Let's talk very quickly about moving forward, and I say forward very deliberately because I feel like moving on is so again, tricky language. I hear you're dating again.
Yes.
Tell me about that, because for some people, for me, I get it. I've moved forward. I've done the dating. I'm now in another relationship. But for some people right now, that feels almost like something they couldn't even think about. It just feels, not fathomable.
I went on my first proper date during lockdown. So my first date was a video date, and it was like this. It was in my kitchen, and he complimented me on my bread bin, and I was like, this is all very odd. And my best friend, who's a very seasoned dater, was like, you understand that this isn't normal. Like, none of this is normal, and I'm worried that this is going to put you off, and it's not like this normally. So I've been dating a while. It's hard. It's a minefield. It's a minefield anyway, I think. You know, I look at female friends who haven't been through what I've been through, and they struggle with it because, you know, it's online dating is horrendous. But I feel like I come with all this extra stuff, which is, it feels it's more tiring. There's more to think about. You know, we were talking recently, and I was saying things like pictures, right? Pictures in the house. I still have pictures of Pat around. Less than there was, but that he's still here. And that's important. I'm not ready to put those away yet. But you know, if you're bringing a date back, it's like, you know, at what point do I mention this? You know, like on one day I was like, do I mention it? Like I was on the bus going, do I mention it like now, or should I have mentioned it earlier, or do I mention it when I open the door, or do I just wait for him just to sort of see it and maybe ask a question? And it's the little things like that that just make it more stressful, I guess. And
because we come with so much more baggage than most women, I suppose. So
do you know what? I thought I came with a lot of baggage as a 30-something widow, but I have to say the guys that I'm dating seem to be through less and have more baggage. So I feel reassured in that way. I would say I'm probably more of a magnet for the Lost Boys, because they feel like they want to understand, they want to engage with, it's what we're talking about, the stereotypes of this kind of grief that I think a particular guy is slightly drawn to, which is probably another session in itself.
that's another
I don't think we're gonna.
So interesting, you've got photographs. What about your wedding ring? Have you taken your wedding ring off?
So the wedding rings were switched when I came back from Mexico, and that was, I came back in January and he passed away in August of the previous year. So I moved them to my other hand. But I have to say I still wear my engagement ring occasionally when I feel like I would like to, but not on my wedding finger.
Okay. And what about, I've got a 5-minute countdown, says Vicky. I'm really conscious of that. But I do want to talk about this next thing, because you talk about the kind of lust for sweaty physicality. And there's a very real thing that widows, unless you're widowed, you don't even know about. It's called widow's fire. It's this need for sex, for companionship, for touch, for feel. You talk about that in the book. Tell me a little bit about it, like really briefly.
Oh, like post
horniness.
Yeah, it was very real. It was very there. It happened quite early on. It felt a lot of guilt that came with that, and that was very difficult to navigate, because, like you say, it did feel very. It was a physical thing. I felt drawn to men's physicalities on the tube, looking at their sort of arms, and it was a weird thing. I felt like I was 15 again. It was very strange, but I think it was my primal way of just wanting to feel something else, because it's just impossible to be in that sort of grief pit for your entire day. You're looking to just feel something that's just going to take you away from that grief, even if it's for like 20 minutes. And I think that's where that started. But it's very much a thing, and I think because we don't talk about it, a lot of people experience that kind of horniness after they've lost someone, and they feel terrible about it. They feel like the worst person in the world. And I'm here to say that you're absolutely not. It's very natural. It doesn't take anything away from the person that you've lost or the relationship you had with that person. It is just you trying to, reform yourself, find yourself, attach. I felt so numb to my own physicality and my body for so long that when it started to rewire again, actually that's where I started to see the dapples of light. That felt quite miraculous to me. Because it just had felt so dark for so long.
So it's getting feeling. It's almost like feeling again, and being allowed to feel again, feel good again as well.
Well, and if we were talking about the elements, and it happens in earth, it's feeling your toes in the earth again. Again, it's I'm here, and I want to live my life. It's so important.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I urge people to read the book, because Kat does go into a little bit more detail. We won't go into that now, but there is some very interesting detail there. I do want to read some comments before we go. Yes. Nick Connery says, my husband died of complications of glioblastoma at 36. I was anticipating a slow decline, but in the end, he was wrenched from me suddenly on Valentine's Day. I cannot understand that he isn't here. Gosh, my heart goes out to you. I'm so sorry. Rami says, my hubby passed of a GBM, also devastating illness. Becky says, my 35-year-old husband suffered cardiac arrest whilst playing football in Dubai on 28th Jan and didn't respond to immediate CPR and defib. Oh, goodness. The book resonates so much. Is it on Kindle? Yes, it is.
It is, yes. And audiobook as well. And also, actually, the paperback is coming out on the 1st of September. So if you want to pre-order that, then you can.
Emma says, mine was also 36 and the day before Valentine's. So sorry for everyone here and the fact we're even together in this space. Gosh. Vicky says The Elements is on Kindle. I did the same. I started wearing color and pattern after my husband died, after years of gravitating towards black and navy. Interesting. Color is such a big
It is
part.
important, yeah, because it's a reflection of who you are. And it's the same that we were saying with, like, you know, the horniness. It's like you can't wear black and feel sad and miserable the whole time. It's just, I just don't think it's possible. And these are just the little ways that you can assert yourself back in the world again, you know, and remind yourself of who you are. I don't think that these are superficial things. I think they're so incredibly important.
There's a lot of weight in all these things. I think my husband, my partner also died from GBM, truly a devastating disease. Wow, a lot of people here with, I think that's all. I've got a 1 minute call. Thanks so much, Kat. Lister says, Emma, thanks both. Fantastic, thank you, says Girl in the Big Glasses. This was amazing, says Roll the Barrel, thanks so much. Christine says, awesome session, great to hear your thoughts. Love from South Africa. How lovely to be all over the world.
We're going global, aren't we?
Oh my gosh, that's so great. Look, I think, Kat, your story, you're telling us everything has touched so many people. You can see that here. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We could have gone on for another hour, I know. What's the future hold for you now? Where are you? What's the next few months looking like for you? I know. Look at me asking
the existential questions to wrap things up. Where am I? I am preparing for the paperback to come out. I'm continuing to write about grief and loss in my journalistic work. Trying to sit down and write a proposal for a second book. So I'm keeping myself busy, but you know, it's not over because I've written this book. You know, it's my experience with grief is constantly evolving and shaping. So expect more essays and articles about this, because as we've been exploring, it's such a multifaceted topic, and I think we need to have more of it out there, don't we? We need to read more. We need more people writing about it. We need more voices.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks so much. Please do follow Kat. It's at Kat Lister on Instagram. You just go up here and you'll see, and we'll put all the details in the comments below. We're still getting comments.
Sorry also that it's got very dark in here all of a sudden.
It's fine, you're fine.
I'm sort of blending into my kitchen.
Girl in the Big Glasses says, all the best to you both. Very touching. Thank you both so much. You're all very welcome. Kat, thank you so much. This has been the first Widowhood Taboo, and we've really just touched on loads of taboos, but I urge you to go out and get the elements available on Amazon, I'm sure, and I'm sure at all good bookshops as well. And Kat, thank you. Next week, I'll be talking to Way member Rupert Hannibal about men and grief during Men's Health Week. And later in the series, I'm talking to writer Stacey Heel. She's the widow of Greg Gilbert, who was a lead singer in the band Delays. Huge thanks to Kat and all the brilliant guests that we've had over the last few weeks. Please do catch up with all our 25 Tuesdays and here on Instagram and also on YouTube. Kat, thank you for your time, and we will keep in touch, I'm sure. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. I'm Shalini Bhalla-Lucas. I'm at Just Joom, JUSTJHOOM, if you'd like to follow me. I'll be back here next Tuesday at 8 o'clock. Until then, please take care of yourselves. Do reach out to Widowed and Young. We're always here for you. Thank you, Kat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.